Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Informer 5 training series. My name is Robin Lamb, and I work with Entrinsik. Today, we're going to go specifically over data sources, how to connect data sources, and some of the different features and things you can do with the data sources. What we're going to talk about is our data source area, and that's connecting our data to Informer. I'm going to click on data sources. There's different types of data sources that you can connect to Informer, and depending on your license or what you've actually purchased from us could depend on what you can connect. A lot of people at this point, if they have Unidata, they might also have SQL because they're using multiple different types of databases. But if we want to click on New Data Source, you'll see that we've got our generic JDBC. These are all the SQL ones that we have. And for those of you that are using SQL Server, a lot of people probably have used the Microsoft SQL Server if you kind of worked with us when we first started. If there are any issues that you're seeing in performance, we can change that to a generic JDBC driver and just basically export the entire schema over to the generic JDBC and connect it up through that. And so I just wanted to let you guys know that that is an option. If you're not having any issues, then don't worry about it. But at this point, when we're hooking up SQL Server, we are using the generic JDBC drivers until Microsoft fixes something inside their SQL Server driver. So that being said, I'm just going to kind of click on the generic JDBC. You can see basically the information that you're going to need on here. There's a server name, and you've got a connection string, your driver class, and we can give all this information to you. The connection string is going to be up to you, where it's going to be your server name and then the database name. And then you're going to add in, basically inside of here, you're going to have your username and your password. And once you add those in, you will need to have a schema name. Now, typically with our colleague database, it's going to be DBO, but depending on what type of database you're using, I know with Banner, you have multiple schemas in there, so you can have and add multiple schemas into your connection, and then they will add into the actual data source. So just know that those are some connection information that you're going to need. And then you can test the connection, and then you can also save it. So once you fill in this information, even if it's not correct, the nice thing about this is I can just type in anything really, and as long as I have some values in there, it's going to allow me to save it. Which in Informer 4, if you guys remember, if it did not connect, you couldn't save the data source. So you can test the connection. I'm going to go through actually connecting one with a MySQL database, but it'll show you whether or not it's connected or not, which is a nice feature for Informer 5. So that's kind of looking at the generic one. I'm going to take a look at the U2. I wanted to kind of go over a couple things on this. We have a lot of Unidata and Universe users. The screen is a little bit different. Again, you've got your name of your data source is up top. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger because I know last week they said it was a little small. Basically, you can do the name of the data source, your server and your port, your username and your password. And these usernames have to be a database user that's going to have at least read access to the database. So just kind of know that. You can do secure connections. You can enable connection pooling. Now, the connection pooling would be something with a U2 environment that would be turned on the database side, and it basically allows how many connections at a time can be hitting the database and pulling back the data. And once it releases that, then it'll allow the next query to run. Typically, with connections, you may want to allow, between. It really depends on how many users you have in Informer. You just have to make sure that, because when you have a connection, it is using a license. So you want to make sure that you've got enough connections in here to allow the queries to be able to run and not wait for a connection to be released. And then, but you also don't want to use so many of your licenses. If everybody does decide to run it all at the same time, let's say you've got 30 people running a query, and it's going to use 30 licenses, so you've kind of got to watch that in terms of people using the licenses for your database also. So it's kind of something to test out and see what you think is going to be the best scenario. There is, if you have initialization subroutines, you can add those subroutines. One of those subroutines for a colleague was the Informer init, so that would be something that you can add as part of your connection. If it is SB Plus enabled, that is something that you can also choose to, you'll have to enable it here in order for the data to come over correctly. Just a couple of things about these items down here. There is the max key list buffer size. If you click on the little question mark, it will give you some information, but what this is referring to is basically dealing with your your iDescriptors or your virtual fields from a linked file. If you are drilling down when you're building your data sets from one file to another and you're using an iDescriptor in that query, it does basically create another query. So this is just basically telling you how many how much it's going to be able to process, and basically they're recommending to keep that set between 10 and 20,000. You may want to kind of tweak it depending on how it seems to be working with your system. The max field pairing is similar in terms of it's dealing with your links, and with the U2 environment, they suggest keeping it at 255. With a SQL, you'll have that same field in there, and the default on that one is set to 2000 for SQL, so it is a little different. You can change your format of your date field if you wanted to have a default value for your date. You can do that. And then also we have a database. This is so if you've got some queries that are running and they're running and they're running and they're running, it's not timing out. You can set this to have a timeout. If it's set at 0, it's just going to run. It's going to keep the connection while the query is running, and it means that it'll wait until the process is finished. In all cases. So if you do want to set a timeout, that way those rogue queries that people are running will time out if they're way too long. So that is something that you can set now on here. And again, you can have the test connection, and you'll have the ability to test that and make sure that it works. All right, so the next part, I'm just going to actually just show you the actually connecting data source and running through that process. So if I hit new data source, I'm going to just go grab a MySQL data source. And I'm going to just go ahead and grab this. So I'm just going to go grab our college ERP. So if I want to connect this, I'm going to add in the server, and the port for MySQL is 3306. And then I can add in my users and my database name. And depending on, the database, for MySQL, the schema name is the database name because there isn't really schemas inside of MySQL. But again, as I said, with the SQL Server, you are going to have to choose the schema, and you need to know where your data is coming from. And then if I hit test connection, it's going to let me know if my connection is successful. The nice thing about this, as I said, is if I do something that's incorrect and I hit the test, it's going to show me immediately that there's a failure, instead of trying to wait for it to process and then not be able to save it. Then I can save my data source, and now I've got a live data source. So this is where we get into the different things that we can do here. So if I wanted to, I can scan the data source right away. If I hit scan data source, I have two options. This is the mappings only, basically brings in all the tables or all the files, but it doesn't bring in the fields. Actually, the mappings will be hidden, and then you can go in and unhide the mappings and scan the tables to bring in the fields. So if I do that, I can show you. If I run that scan, it's just going to bring in all the mappings, and when I look under here, they're automatically going to be hidden. If I wanted to unhide everything, I could just hide. I can highlight that, hold my shift key down, and then I could say unhide and scan. So I can just unhide them if I want to, or I can unhide and scan the mappings. And that's going to go and it's going to scan all the mappings, and then it's going to bring in all the fields for all the mappings. Actually, I think it brings in it just unhides everything. And then if I click on an individual, it brings in the fields. The options there are to either scan just mappings, it's going to put them in the hidden, or you can run a full scan, it's going to pull everything in and it's going to pull all the fields in. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing you can do is if things change on your database, you can rescan the data source. It's going to go out and it's going to bring in any new files or fields that you're creating and bring them into Informer. Something just to kind of note, if you have a very large database, which a lot of you guys do, if you click on this feature right here and say hide empty mappings, nice thing that it's going to do is it's going to scan your entire database, and any mappings that are not being used or fields that are not being used, it will hide them so they're not junking up the rest of the mapping. So you can see in here it hid 4 of the mappings that basically there's no data living in any of the fields. We've now created a data source. I'm going to go create one more data source too in just a second. We do have this other option. So we are going to talk about migrating. So I realize that that's a big question from 4 to 5. That is next week. But one of the options that we have inside of Informer was we also can create what's called an export of the schema. So if I wanted to export this schema, I can click on this and I can say export, and it's going to create, and I can pick and choose what I want to export out. So if you have like a test environment that you want to import into a live environment, you can do that. I can hit export. It's going to create the JSON package. And then if I go and create a brand new data source, so if I click on my SQL again, and I can say test data source, and I'll just do localhost 3306. And again, add in all my information. And then I hit save. I can now have the option to import a schema also. So this is going from Informer 5 to Informer 5. This is not going to Informer 4 to Informer 5. So if I click on import schema, I can go choose my file, or I can just drag it. I can just drag it into here, and I could just go like this and drag it in. It's going to go ahead and click on that, and if I hit import, it's going to go and basically pull in the entire schema into the new data source. So that's what the import export option is for that. So we've now covered creating a data source. We've now covered hiding your empty mappings. We do have one other feature down here that I'm just going to show you really quickly. On your settings, you can click on the settings and you can actually turn off the sample data for the entire data source. So if you don't want people seeing any sample data when they build their data sets or their ad hoc queries, then you can actually turn that off right here. And then when they go to do that, they won't see any actual data when they're building it out. You could also do that on the data set level where the sample data is turned off, but if this is something you want to do on a specific data source, you can do that also. Okay, the other thing that you can do on any of these is the collaboration piece where you can add a comment to this and then people will be able to see that in their news feed. So basically all throughout Informer 5, there will be these little comment sections where you can add, so you can say, you know, added a new file or a new table to the database or something like that. You can add that in there, and then people that also have access to this will be able to see the little notes that are in there. So just those are that kind of is shown throughout. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to here. So now we're going to talk a little bit about links and how the links work. So we have lots of different types of links, but just a basic link. I'm going to go back out to my other data source. So let's go into our Postgres. So I'm going to click on, if I want to click on links, I can add links. So the new links that I have field pairings, I have remote data source, and I have SQL. If I do a field pairing, that is just a general, I'm just going to create a link. So if I want to go create a link from orders to order details, I can create that link, and I can just go ahead and choose the field from orders that I want to go to the field from order details. The options you have here are left, inner, and outer, or left, right, and inner. And you can add an extra pairing if you wanted to. So if you wanted to pair this up with something else, then you can actually add a second pairing for your SQL joins. The other thing you can do in here is you could actually create like a scalar join. So if I wanted to do something like a scalar join, I could create an inner, and then I can add a literal. So if I'm creating a scalar join, it might be saying I want to create a link that has from orders I only want to see for a specific customer. So it's almost like adding in, a criteria to your query. So you have the ability to kind of use these scalar joins to pass through values. So I can kind of show you what this will look like when you go to a data set. If I hit save on this and I go out to create a data set from that, let me add that name. I probably need to name the link also. Just be careful when you start to add these links in and naming them so that you'll see them the way that you want to see them, because otherwise it'll just default to whatever's in the link name. So if I hit save, and then if I go out to create a data set from this, I can hit new data set. I'm going to go new data set designer. I'm going to choose, I'll say scalar test. We're going to choose my data source for Northwind. I'm going to choose my mapping for orders. And I'm going to hit save. And when I go to add fields here, you'll now see I've got the vignette order details. So when I add in information from here and go into here and then add all here and hit close, I'm only going to see information from vignette because I've actually passed this customer ID through inside my join. So this is a way to be able to kind of filter out data if that is specifically only what you want people to see. Again, you do need to be careful when you're creating these that you label them so that you can see what's going on. And if you can see right here, I've got order to order detail here. And if I click on that, it's going to open up to product. And the same thing happens if I'm going to the vignette to product, because it's still linked, but I'm only going to still see information that is associated with vignette because I've actually put that that value inside of the join itself. One of the nice things about Informer 5 that we did not have in Informer 4 is you also have the ability to create a link on the fly. If I click on this little three dots right here, or actually, if I click on the place where I choose my fields, you will have this option right here, which is called link options. I can click on that and I can add a link from here. Now, you have to have specific rights to the data source to be able to do this. Not everybody's going to be able to do this. You don't want everybody to be able to do this. But if I add a link in here, it'll add that link to the data source. So, but it's really nice when you're starting to build out your data inside of Informer. You will get a package, hopefully, or if it's a database that we don't have a package for, then you have to build out your own links. And sometimes you start to build out data sets and then you realize that you need to add a link later. You don't have to go all the way back to the data source. You can do it right from here. So just know that that option is also available. Okay, so I'm going to go back out to my data source and keep covering the links. So the other type of link that you can create in here, if I do a new link, I can do a remote data source link. So a remote data source would be if I click on a remote data source, I'm in Northwind, and let's say I want to, I'm going to go from orders. Let's see, we'll go from employees maybe. And I'll hit, let's say I want to go out to another database, and I choose like person, and I can click on person, and then it's going to ask me, so from the employees, what do I want? I want to grab the ID or employee ID, and I want to go to the person ID inside of here. Now these won't link up because they don't really match, but what you can do then is if you have multiple databases inside of Informer, then you can link them together, and then you can create data sets from those. So if I do this, I'll just show you what it looks like on the data set side. So let me open this up over here. I can click on new data set designer, and we can say remote test. I can grab my Northwind. I'm going to start with that one, and I'm going to go from, actually it was from employees, and if I click on save and I click on add field, I'll now have a link from employees, and I should have renamed this to, it would have been the college ERP person table, and then I could get down into those fields. So you can add fields from both databases into one. Okay, the last type of link that I have in here is if I click on new link, I can also do SQL links, which are basically native SQL queries. So if I wanted to do this, and it does have a little bit of a UI to help you through this, but if I click on here, I can say orders, and I want to go to from orders to order details. And then it's going to give me the option in here, and it even helps you kind of through this. So I can say order, it's going to be the order ID, and I can say equals the order details, order ID. So it actually helps you. And then you can do, where, and you can start to add in where clauses and make them more complex if you'd like to. There's just two ways to build out the links, but this gives you the option to make the links a little more complex in case you need that. The other thing that we have, and this is actually throughout everything, the embed link, and that we had this in Informer 4 too. If I choose to embed right here, everything in order details will actually show up under orders, and you will not see that drop down from orders to order details. Sometimes I've seen people create smaller tables that they only had a couple fields in, and they wanted just to embed the link so it looks like it's kind of living under that top table, but it basically does the same thing. It just really only shows up under the parent table that you're starting with. So that's what the embed link is, and you can do that in any of the link types that I've showed you so far. Okay. Also, just, as you can see, the nice thing about this is you also can kind of go through and it'll look at each of these items, and you'll be able to see the links that are associated from which mapping they're coming from. So it's a little easier to find. And again, you still have the search button where if I, typed in orders, it's going to show me all the links that have the word order in them somewhere. The other thing that we have inside of here, if I go into any specific, let's say I went into employees and I wanted to hide a field, I can click on a field and I can go in here and I can restrict the field. You also have formatting options. if there's anything you want to do. You can also change the data type. So sometimes the data does not come over exactly how or maybe for some reason it gets changed, or Informer doesn't quite realize the data type the right way. You can also come in here and change the data type. If you do a restricted, basically we can restrict the fields inside of here, and if I hit save, now if you share this database out to a team, so if I click on access and I say share data source, and I say for the Intrinsic team, I only want them to have limited access to this data source, which means that anybody that's going to create ad hoc queries or data sets, then they won't have access to any of the restricted fields. It's only from the data source to creating data sets or queries. Now, if something gets added, if a person that has access has full access to a data source, and they send it over and they create a data set, and then they send that data set, they share that data set out with somebody, and that birth date field is in the data set, then that does not prevent the shared data set from having it. It really is only for people who you're trying to limit what they can use in building out the queries. And the teams and the security will cover more of this, but I just kind of wanted to show you how the limited access works versus the full access on a restricted field. The other thing that you can do inside of the mappings is if I click on a specific, see here, we're going to go into employees. I can add a field. So if I wanted to add a custom expression, I can do that. So basically what this is doing is it's allowing you to use SQL functions. So this is for SQL, and I believe we also have that option in the U2 environment. So I built this earlier, but basically you can create it by, we don't need the mapping alias in there, but it would just be name.first, or name first versus the name last, which is the name of those. And if I hit test, it's going to show me down below that it's giving me exactly what I'm asking for. So that was just something that we're using, like a regular SQL function, which is concat. But if you guys have SQL functions in your database that you want to bring in, you can refer to those in these custom expressions and bring them in as a field to use, or you can create your own, as I said, using some of the native SQL functions that are available. So just know that you have that ability also. Okay, and then lastly, we have what are called mapping sets. So if you decide that you want to separate out your data based on the tables or the files, we have the ability to create mapping sets so that if you are only going to allow a specific group of people to have access to create queries or data sets from a specific group of files, we can actually add those to our mapping sets. So if I look inside of here, I can look at my mapping sets. I can manage my sets. For right now, I've got order details set and I've got an HR set. I can add a new set if I want to. You know, maybe we want to look at, we can call it like finance. I can create a brand new set and I can choose which mappings are going to be associated in that set. I can create a color and I can choose a little icon and I can hit apply, and that's going to be my finance mapping set, and I can hit done. If I want to then add something to that, so let's just say these, these three, these items I want to add to a mapping set, I can say change set. So I hit my actions button and I can go and apply that to my finance. And if I can hit apply, you're going to see the little purple taxi now is associated with those sets. And you can also see up here that I've got two different sets. of mappings. And what happens then is when I go out to share my data set, my data source to a team, and again, we're going to cover this. If I click on the items down here, you'll see down below that I have mapping set access. So let's say my Intrinsik team is going to have limited or full access to those 4 tables because that's what's in that finance group. So if I hit limited access to finance, if there are any restricted fields inside those 4 tables, then they would not be able to use those fields to build the data sets or the queries. If I do full access to those 4 tables, that's what they have access to. So if you have multiple mapping sets that you are building out and then giving access to, you can choose whether or not they have limited or full access to those tables. So again, the sharing part, you've got limited access, which gives you access to all tables, but no restricted fields. You have full access, which gives you access to everything on that data source, or you have custom access where you start to use the mapping sets and only allow the teams to have specific access to specific tables, depending on what you're going to look at that way. Okay, and again, that will be covered a little bit deeper when we get into the teams and security, but it is part of the setup of the data sources. Okay, the last part of this for the data sources is the last type of data source that you can create is going to be your workspace. So a workspace is basically like creating your own mini data warehouse or database inside of Informer. Basically what it does is it creates Postgres database tables and it creates a data source that you can use like a database. So I'm going to just say, we'll just say our test workspace, and I'm going to hit save. And what it's going to allow me to do is I can upload data. So I can choose my files. Let's see, we'll go to and I've got these 3 CSVs, so you can do as many as you want. And each CSV, basically what it does is it creates a table per CSV. Now these have to be rows and columns, no special characters. It needs to be very clean. If you click, once it uploads it like that, if I hit configure, you'll see it's going to show you what type of fields are in there and what's going on. It may give you errors where it's not, it can't, it'll tell you that it can't read it or it needs to be a different data type or something like that. So it does try to figure out the data, but again, it has to be a very clean CSV to be able to import it. But once I import them, you'll see that it pulls that data in, and now I've got 3 mappings that with each column header, it's creating all those fields inside of there. And then what happens is you can actually create a data set from this, or you can link and do a remote link from like your colleague database or your Resware database or your manufacturing database to this workspace. So it gives you kind of added ability to pull in data that may not be saved in your database that you may need to link up. At this point, you have to re-import the data if the data changes, but we are working on a way to be able to automate being able to refresh the workspace from an existing like a CSV or something that's outside the database. But if you needed to re-import, you can either, let's see, we'll go back out to the data source. So now you'll see under our types, we've got workspace. And if I click on that and hit actions, I can import the data again. So if I import the data, it's going to ask me to go out and grab those CSVs again if they've changed, and it'll update anything. If you've added fields or done anything like that, then it'll do that. And then you can obviously build the data sets or the queries off of those data sources. So I appreciate everybody joining us. The next session is going to be on migration, and Tim Nicholson will be doing that one. I hope it was informational, and we'll Talk to you soon. Have a good day.